The rain was still falling when Daniel pulled off the road. He hadn't planned to stop. He was tired. It had been a long day. He just wanted to get home. But something moved near the ditch. Small, slow, wrong. At first he thought it was a leaf caught in the wind. Then he heard it. A sound so small, so desperate, that it stopped him cold. Not a bird, not the wind. Something alive, something crying. He stepped out of the truck. The rain soaked through his jacket in seconds. His boots sank into the mud at the roadside. And there, half hidden in the wet grass, was the smallest creature he had ever seen. A Pallas's cat cub, no bigger than his 2 fists placed together, soaking wet, shaking so hard it could barely hold its head up, alone. Daniel didn't move for a long moment. He looked around, into the trees, down the road in both directions. Nothing, no mother, no tracks, no sound but the rain. The cub looked up at him. Its eyes were barely open. Its whole body was trembling. And then it did something Daniel didn't expect. It stopped crying, just for a second, as if it had been waiting. As if it had heard his footsteps and thought, maybe this is the one. Daniel was 31 years old. He had moved to this quiet house in the countryside 8 months ago. After his mother passed, the city felt too loud, too fast, too full of people who didn't notice that something in him had gone quiet. He worked from home. He cooked simple meals. He went to bed early. Life had become something he moved through rather than something he lived. He wasn't unhappy exactly. He was just empty. The kind of empty that doesn't hurt anymore. It just sits there, taking up space. He reached down slowly. His hand hovered just above the cub. He wasn't sure why he hesitated. Maybe he was afraid of doing something wrong. Maybe some part of him already knew that once he touched this animal, everything would be different. He picked it up. It fit in one hand. The cub didn't fight him, didn't scratch, didn't try to run. It pressed its small wet face against his palm, and it went still. Daniel stood there in the rain for a long moment, holding this tiny shaking life in his hands. He didn't know what kind of cat it was. He didn't know if it was sick. He didn't know if there was anything he could do. He only knew one thing. He couldn't leave it here. He called wildlife authorities that same night. They came out the next morning, checked the surrounding area for nearly 3 hours. No den, no mother, no signs she had been there recently. The officer was kind but honest. "He's too young," she said. "Without consistent warmth and feeding, he won't make it through another cold night." She explained the situation carefully. A facility could take him eventually, but not yet. He was too fragile for transport, too small. "Could you manage just a few days?" she asked. "Just until he stabilizes?" Daniel looked at the cub sitting in the cardboard box on his kitchen table. The cub looked back. "Yeah," Daniel said. "I can do a few days." That first night, Daniel set up a small space in the corner of the bedroom. Warm blankets, a hot water bottle wrapped in a towel, a shallow dish of the formula the officer had left behind. He showed the cub the space, settled him in carefully. Then he turned off the light and got into bed. For about 4 minutes the house was quiet. Then it started, a sound unlike anything Daniel had heard before. Not loud, not dramatic. Just small, insistent, heartbreaking. The cub was crying. Daniel waited. Maybe he would settle. Maybe he just needed a minute. The crying continued. Daniel got up and turned on the lamp. The cub was standing at the edge of the blanket, facing the bed, crying steadily like a tiny alarm that had no off switch. Daniel stood there in the middle of the room. "You're fine," he said quietly. "You're warm, you're safe." The cub cried. Daniel picked him up. The crying stopped instantly. He stood there holding a Pallas's cat cub in his dark bedroom at midnight. And somewhere in the silence that followed, something shifted. He just didn't know yet what it meant. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a crick in his neck. He had fallen asleep in the armchair. The cub was on his chest, completely still, completely relaxed, rising and falling with Daniel's breathing like he had been sleeping there his whole life. Daniel looked down at him for a long moment. He didn't move, didn't want to disturb him. Outside, the rain had stopped. Pale morning light was coming through the curtains. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in months. Not empty quiet, just quiet. He named him Tundra. He wasn't sure why exactly. It just fit. Something about those wide, pale eyes, that thick, soft fur. The way he looked at the world like he was studying it from a great distance. Tundra. It suited him. The first week was not easy. Every 2 to 3 hours, day and night, Daniel was up with the bottle. Tundra was a slow feeder at first, suspicious of the rubber nipple, turning his face away, pawing at Daniel's hand. But hunger is a patient teacher. By the third day he was feeding steadily. By the fifth day he was finishing every drop and looking for more. Daniel started keeping a notebook on the kitchen counter. Weight, feeding times, behavior notes. He hadn't kept a notebook since college. By the end of the second week, Tundra had discovered the rest of the house. This was, Daniel would later say, both the best and worst development of the entire experience. Tundra was everywhere. He followed Daniel from room to room like a small shadow with opinions. If Daniel sat down, Tundra climbed onto him. If Daniel stood up, Tundra was already ahead of him, waiting at the doorway, tail moving slowly. He attacked shoelaces with a seriousness that suggested he considered it important work. He climbed the back of the sofa and launched himself onto Daniel's shoulders at random intervals throughout the day. He discovered the laundry basket on a Tuesday afternoon and fell into it head first. Daniel found him 20 minutes later, sitting inside it, looking deeply unbothered. He growled at the vacuum cleaner, not a small growl, a full, committed, deeply offended growl, as if the vacuum had personally insulted him and he wanted it to know. Daniel laughed so hard he had to sit down on the floor. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed like that. Something was happening. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you don't notice until you look back and realize it had been happening for weeks. Daniel was sleeping better. Not because anything in his life had changed. His parents were still gone. The house was still quiet. The routine was still the same. But now the routine had Tundra in it. Morning feeding, then coffee. Then Tundra sitting on the windowsill while Daniel worked, watching birds in the garden with the focused attention of someone who had plans. Evening walk around the property. Tundra sometimes following at a careful distance, stopping when Daniel stopped, moving when Daniel moved. Dinner. Then Tundra claiming his spot on the armchair like he paid rent. Simple things, small things, but they were anchors, and Daniel hadn't had anchors in a long time. 3 months passed. Tundra was no longer a handful of fur and fragile bones. He was lean and strong, with a thick winter coat and a personality that had fully arrived and showed no signs of leaving. He was not affectionate in the way a domestic cat is affectionate. He didn't purr loudly or need blankets or demand to be held. He was more deliberate than that. He chose when to be close. He chose when to make contact. And when he did, when he jumped up beside Daniel on the couch and sat with their shoulders nearly touching, not looking at him, just present, it felt like something meaningful, like trust that had been decided, not given automatically. Daniel understood that. One evening in early spring, Daniel was sitting on the back steps watching Tundra move through the long grass at the edge of the yard. He was hunting moths, badly, missing every single one and refusing to acknowledge it. Daniel watched him and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Grateful, not for anything specific, just for the evening, for the grass and the light, for this strange small animal who had fallen into his life on a rainy road and decided, apparently, to stay. He thought about his mother. How she used to say that the things that find you are more important than the things you look for. He hadn't believed that for a while. He was starting to again. Then came the phone call. The wildlife officer, checking in, asking how Tundra was doing. Daniel told her, the weight, the behaviors, the hunting attempts. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said what Daniel had known was coming. He sounds really healthy, Daniel. Strong. That's wonderful. We should probably start talking about the next steps. Release. The word landed differently than Daniel expected. He had always known this was temporary. He had agreed to it. He believed in it. But standing there in his kitchen, watching Tundra bat a bottle cap across the floor with total concentration, he realized something he hadn't let himself think clearly before. He didn't want Tundra to go. Not because he was selfish, not because he hadn't thought about what was best, but because somewhere in the last 3 months, without any ceremony or announcement, Tundra had become family. Release day was set for a Thursday morning in late April. The wildlife team arrived early. They were kind, professional. They spoke gently about the habitat, the protection, the future Tundra deserved. Daniel nodded and said the right things. He loaded the carrier himself. Tundra walked in without hesitation, turned around and sat down facing outward. He looked at Daniel through the mesh door. Daniel looked back. Neither of them moved for a long moment. They drove an hour into protected wilderness land, rolling hills, dense brush, exactly the terrain a Pallas's cat was built for. The team set up carefully, gave Daniel the signal. He opened the carrier door. Tundra stepped out slowly. He stood at the edge of the brush and looked out at the open land ahead of him, ears forward, nose reading the air. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like he might walk forward. Then he stopped. He turned around, he looked directly at Daniel, and he walked back. The team exchanged glances. They guided him out again, waited. Tundra sat down at the edge of the release point and looked at the wilderness like a man studying a menu in a language he doesn't speak. Then he turned around and walked back to Daniel again and again. One of the officers knelt down beside Daniel and spoke quietly. "This happens sometimes," she said carefully. "With animals raised in early bonding, they can struggle to distinguish the wild from the familiar." She paused. "He may not be ready, and honestly," she looked at Tundra sitting calmly beside Daniel's boot, "he may never fully be." The words settled over Daniel like cold air. This wasn't just a hard goodbye anymore. This was something more complicated, something neither of them had prepared for. And standing there in that open field, with Tundra pressed quietly against his leg, Daniel had absolutely no idea what came next. The drive home was quiet. Tundra sat in the carrier on the back seat. He wasn't crying, wasn't restless. He just sat there, calm and composed, like a passenger who had known all along they weren't staying. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. He didn't know what to feel exactly. Relief and guilt had gotten tangled up somewhere on that hillside, and he hadn't been able to separate them since. He had wanted Tundra to stay, and Tundra had stayed, and somehow that felt less like a victory and more like a question he wasn't qualified to answer. The wildlife officer called that evening. She had already been in touch with a colleague, a specialist in wild felid rehabilitation, someone who had spent 20 years working specifically with animals caught between the wild and the human world. "There's a sanctuary," she said, "about 2 hours from you. They have large protected habitat, real wilderness conditions, but managed, safe." She let that sit for a moment. "They've worked with cases like Tundra before, animals who were bonded too early. They don't force the wild, they let the animal find it in their own time, or not, Daniel repeated. "Some of them never fully go back," she said honestly, "but they live well, they live whole." "That's not a failure, Daniel. That's just a different life than the one we planned for them." Daniel was quiet for a long time. Tundra was on the armchair across the room, watching him, that steady, considering gaze. "When would they need to know?" Daniel asked. "Soon," she said. "But take a few days." He took 3 days. He spent them the way he had spent the last few months. Morning coffee, work, Tundra at the window, evening walk, simple things. But now he paid attention differently. He noticed the way Tundra moved through the house, confident, unhurried, like he owned the walls and the floorboards, and the particular quality of light that came through the kitchen window at 4 in the afternoon. He noticed how Tundra still paused at the back door sometimes, looking out, nose twitching, watching something in the long grass that Daniel couldn't see. There was still something wild in him, quiet and patient and waiting. It hadn't gone. It had just learned to live alongside everything else. On the 3rd evening, Daniel sat on the back steps. Tundra came and sat beside him without being invited, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the garden in the fading light. Daniel didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "I think you need more than this." Tundra's ear turned toward him, then turned back. The garden was still. "I think you need space I can't give you. And others like you, and people who actually know what they're doing." He looked down at the small, solid weight of Tundra beside him. "I think this is the right thing." He wasn't sure if he was convincing Tundra or himself, maybe both. He called the sanctuary the next morning. They were ready for him. The sanctuary was not what Daniel had imagined. He had pictured cages, clinical spaces, the kind of place that was good for animals but hard to look at. Instead, he found rolling land enclosed by wide natural fencing, dense brush, rock formations, spaces designed to feel like the world the animals came from. The director met them at the gate, a woman in her 50s named Ruth, with kind eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned patience from animals. She looked at Tundra in his carrier and smiled. "Hello, handsome," she said softly. Tundra regarded her with dignified suspicion. Ruth looked at Daniel. "He's beautiful and clearly healthy. You did good work." Daniel nodded, didn't trust himself to say much. They spent 2 hours there that first day. Ruth walked Daniel through the habitat, explained the routine, the other animals, the staff who would be with Tundra every day. She showed him the space that would be Tundra's, wide and wild and full of the kind of terrain he had been bred for over thousands of years. Tundra stood at the entrance to the habitat and looked in. His ears moved forward, his nose worked steadily. Something in his posture changed, subtle, hard to name, like a key turning in a lock that had been stiff for a long time. He looked back at Daniel once, then he walked forward. He didn't run, he walked, slow and deliberate, the way he did everything. He moved through the brush and disappeared. Daniel stood at the fence for a long time. Ruth stood beside him. "He'll be okay," she said. "I know," Daniel said, and he did know. That was the strange thing. He knew it completely, and it still felt like something tearing. The drive home took 2 hours. The house was very quiet when he got back. Not the empty quiet from before Tundra, different from that, fuller somehow, even in the silence, like a room where something important had happened and left its shape behind. He sat in the armchair where Tundra used to sleep. He didn't turn on the television, didn't make coffee, just sat. He thought about his parents, about the months after he lost them when the house felt like a container with nothing in it, about the rainy evening on that road, the sound he almost didn't stop for. He thought about how strange it was that grief and love and loss and healing could all arrive in the same small shaking body. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were different from the emptiness before. He found himself calling the sanctuary every few days. Ruth always answered, always had something to tell him. Tundra exploring further into the habitat, Tundra watching the other animals from a careful distance, Tundra eating well, small reports, small reassurances, they were enough. 2 months after the drop-off, Daniel drove out to a wildlife rescue center 40 minutes from his house. He hadn't planned to volunteer. He had just gone to drop off a donation, some supplies Ruth had suggested, but he stayed for 3 hours. There was a litter of fox cubs recovering from mange, a barn owl with an injured wing, 2 young hedgehogs found on a roadside. He held one of the fox cubs wrapped in a towel, while a vet checked its sibling. The cub pressed its face into the crook of his arm. Something moved in his chest, familiar and warm. He looked at the volunteer coordinator on his way out. "Is there any way I could come back?" he asked. "Regularly, I mean, to help." She smiled. "We'd love that." He went back the following week, and the week after, and the week after that. 6 months passed. Daniel's life looked different from the outside, busier, more connected. There were people now, the staff at the rescue center, the volunteers, Ruth at the sanctuary, who had become something like a friend. Inside it felt different too. Not healed exactly. Grief doesn't work like that. It doesn't vanish, it changes shape. But he was living forward again, making choices about the future, caring about things. Tundra had done that, without trying, without knowing, just by needing someone and choosing Daniel to be that person. Then one morning, almost exactly a year after the sanctuary drop-off, his phone rang. "Ruth," he answered on the second ring. "Daniel," her voice was different, not worried, not sad, something else. "I need you to come out here," she said. "Is he okay?" Daniel asked immediately. "He's more than okay," she said. A pause. "Just come. You need to see this yourself." Daniel was in his car before she finished the sentence. He drove the 2 hours without stopping. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was running in every direction. What had happened? What she had seen? What could possibly make Ruth, calm, steady, unshakable Ruth, sound like that? He pulled through the sanctuary gates just after noon. Ruth was waiting for him. She was smiling, wide and quiet and full of something. "Come with me," she said, and she led him toward the habitat, toward whatever was waiting on the other side of that fence. Ruth didn't say anything as they walked. That was unlike her. She was someone who filled silence with information, facts about the animals, updates on the habitat, observations she had made that week. But right now she just walked, and somehow that told Daniel more than words would have. They stopped at the far viewing area, the part of the sanctuary that backed onto the widest section of habitat, dense brush, rocky outcroppings, the kind of terrain that looked like it had always been there. Ruth pointed quietly. Daniel looked. At first he didn't understand what he was seeing. Tundra was there, lying on a flat rock in the afternoon sun, still and relaxed in the way only a completely comfortable animal can be. But he wasn't alone. Pressed against his side was a small cub, maybe 6 weeks old, eyes still carrying that new uncertain quality, fur thick and soft. And on his other side, another one, and curled near his feet, a third. 3 orphaned Pallas's cat cubs, all rescued within the past 2 months, all struggling, Ruth had told Daniel on the phone, to settle, to eat properly, to feel safe enough to rest, until Tundra. "It started about 3 weeks ago," Ruth said quietly, her eyes still on the habitat. "We placed the first cub, the little female, in the adjoining space just to see how he'd respond. We weren't sure. He's always been a little solitary, watchful." She paused. He went to her within the hour. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off the rock. Tundra was grooming the smallest cub now. Slow, steady strokes. The cub's eyes were half closed. The other two came in the following weeks, Ruth continued. Different circumstances, different rescues, but the same story. Unsettled, refusing food, not sleeping. She glanced at Daniel. "We put them near Tundra. Within a day, both of them, completely different animals." Daniel watched. The smallest cub shifted in its sleep. Tundra adjusted without waking, made space, resettled, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like he had always known how to do this. "The staff started calling him the anchor," Ruth said. "The other cubs, they calmed down around him. We don't fully understand it. Maybe his scent, maybe something behavioral, maybe just the fact that he's steady." She smiled quietly. "He was the most anxious animal in this sanctuary when he arrived, you know. Took weeks before he'd let any of us get close. Weeks before he stopped watching the gate." She looked at Daniel directly. "Whatever you gave him, that steadiness, that sense that the world can be safe, he kept it. And now he's giving it to them." Daniel didn't say anything for a long time. His throat was doing something he didn't want to examine too closely. He thought about that first night, the crying that wouldn't stop, standing in the dark bedroom holding a soaking wet cub the size of his hand. He thought about all the nights after, the 2 a.m. feedings, the notebook on the counter, the slow patient work of convincing a wild animal that not everything in the world was a threat. He hadn't thought of it as giving anything. He had just been showing up, because Tundra needed him to. And because somewhere in the showing up, he had needed it too. As if on cue, as if some instinct older than either of them had sent a signal through the air. Tundra raised his head. He looked toward the fence, toward Daniel. The distance was real, 20 meters at least. A full year of separation between them. Tundra looked at him for a long, steady moment. His ears came forward. His posture changed. Not tense, the opposite. A kind of recognition that moved through his whole body like a slow exhale. He didn't get up, didn't run to the fence. He was wild now, in all the ways that mattered. He lived here. This was his world. But he looked at Daniel the way you look at someone who was there at the beginning. The way you look at someone who held you when you were too small to hold yourself. Daniel raised his hand, slowly. Just a small gesture. Tundra watched it. Then he lowered his head back down, rested his chin near the smallest cub, and closed his eyes. Ruth put her hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to add. On the drive home, Daniel pulled over once. Just for a few minutes. He sat with the windows down, the evening air moving through the car, the kind of late light that makes everything look like it was painted carefully by someone who cared about the details. He thought about his mother again, the things she used to say. He thought about a rainy road, and a sound he almost didn't stop for. He thought about how thin the line is, between the life you almost lived and the life that found you. One sound, one hesitation, one decision to pull over instead of drive on. And from that single moment, a year of living forward, a house that felt like a home again, people he cared about, work that meant something, and 3 small cubs sleeping in the sun because someone once stopped in the rain. He didn't know what came next. He wasn't sure he needed to. For the first time in a long time, the not knowing felt less like emptiness and more like space, room for whatever was coming, room to keep showing up. He started the car, drove home through the long evening light. The road was quiet and familiar, and his. Back at the sanctuary, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the habitat settled into dusk, Tundra lay on his rock. The 3 cubs were asleep around him, small warm weights, soft breathing. He was still and watchful the way he always was, reading the air, listening to things too quiet for human ears. But underneath the watching, underneath the wildness, something in him was at rest, the way it had first learned to be rest in the arms of a man who had needed saving just as much as he did. They found a tiny Pallas's cat cub beside a lonely mountain road, cold, hungry, barely old enough to walk. What nobody knew that evening was that the kindness shown to one small abandoned life wouldn't end there. It would be carried forward, from one pair of hands to one small animal, from that animal to 3 more, and from those 3 in time, to others still, a single moment of mercy, multiplying quietly in the dark,